Barlow, the typing was by Dr. Popovic. Well, the first page of this document said Dr. Popovic had obviously been very accurate, very honest. It said, I am using the French virus, then called LAV, which I've renamed HTLV3, which was the name of the American virus. He didn't lie. He said exactly what he was doing. He'd obviously decided that he wasn't going to cheat in any way at all. I then turned over to page 2 of this same document, and I found deletions to this document that had not been reported previously in any forum, in any newspaper, on television, nowhere. It said, despite the very best of efforts, the cause of AIDS cannot be discovered. We have not found a causative agent causing AIDS. Well, I just couldn't really believe what I was reading because this is not reported. Why isn't it reported? Well, I thought maybe it is a statement that later on in the same paper, he's gone on to say, well, I thought that at first, but I reversed my opinion later on. I read his conclusion to his paper, and it was utterly consistent with his earlier statement in the same paper. The conclusion states, before it got rewritten by the head of the laboratory, that all he had managed to do was grow some of the French virus in a laboratory culture, as shown by an enzyme, RT, or reverse transcriptase. He has seen this intermittently, and he associated the presence of this enzyme, which we now know to be in every human cell, but he associated it with the presence of the French virus. That's it. His last words of his paper were, and this is the first time this has been reported like this, publicly, was that the tests on this virus now are a possibility for the future. That's it. All he did. At no point in his research, in his paper, does he claim to have tested this virus for to see if it's a pathogen. At no point did he relate it to AIDS. He didn't attempt any such experiment. But Robert Gallo, his boss, was so confident of what his senior scientists would discover that he'd gone off to Britain and to France, where he'd given a lecture at the Pasteur Institute saying that he'd found the AIDS virus. This is while his chief scientist was doing the research. He'd already sent proteins to be manufactured into the HIV test before the experiment was done. To repeat that, he'd already, so we could not make an HIV test before we find HIV. We couldn't use proteins as coming from HIV before we found HIV. He sent before he did the experiment. The same material was used for the first PCR probes to detect HIV. This is colossal. I mean, I could not believe what I was reading, because why hasn't this been reported previously? This were government documents unearthed by American government scientists, by major institutions, and it seems they only looked at these documents to see which virus he used. When they found he hadn't used the American virus, but he used the French virus, they then gave credit to the French, and the French immediately got a share in the royalties to the HIV test. Then they must have stopped reading, because if they'd read on, they must have read on, but it's quite colossal what is in the rest of the paper. Alongside this, I found a letter, again exposed by the same government investigators, from the head of electron microscopy at the National Cancer Institute, where Robert Gallo's laboratory was situated. This is Dr. Gonda, a man of very fine reputation. He reported to Dr. Popovic and Dr. Gallo. He said, that sample of your AIDS virus that you've just sent me for imaging for publication purposes, i.e. in the Science Journal, contains no virus at all. It has only in it cellular degradation products. It has nothing of the size of a retrovirus. He copied it to 3 members of the laboratory to make sure there was no mistake. This was dated 4 days before Robert Garlow gave the paper to the Science Journal for publication. In the paper as published, there are photographs, micrographs, attributed to Dr. Gonda, in which the authors of the paper, Dr. Popovic, Dr. Garlow, state it is the AIDS virus, quite contrary to Dr. Gonda's advice. I'm sorry, but this is clear fraud. I cannot conclude anything else. It doesn't matter what it goes on afterwards, but I think we should call on the editors of the Science Journal to immediately withdraw these papers. What other courses are in scientific ethics? How this paper came to light is also interesting. Dr. Popovic was very worried by what his boss was getting up to, Dr. Garlow. He had been left in charge of doing these experiments, knowing that Dr. Garlow was briefing the BBC, saying he had already found the AIDS virus. This was before the experiments were concluded. He had to type up a report already arranged for publication in the Science Journal, along with 3 accompanying papers. There was nothing here that these papers were, sorry, I'm straight to sin. Dr. Popovic writes very seriously about what he'd been asked to do. And he typed up his manuscript, as far as I can judge, utterly honestly in every respect. I cannot fault his report. But I'm talking about his original typed manuscript. When Dr. Garlow returned from overseas, where he'd been boasting of his achievements at the Pasteur Institute, he found on his desk a typed manuscript, this typed manuscript left behind by Dr. Popovic, who had gone skiing in Utah, leaving his boss to read his findings. Remember, HIV test has already been manufactured, BBC have been briefed, the American government has been briefed. All this had been done beforehand, and suddenly he comes back and finds 10 days before it had to be handed in for publication, a report from his chief scientist saying he could not find the cause of AIDS, that it was not the French virus, because that's what he was experimenting with. He immediately phoned up Dr. Popovic and ordered his immediate return from his skiing vacation. Dr. Popovic arrived back in Washington 6 days before publication date to find on his desk this manuscript, his typed manuscript, covered with handwritten changes by his boss, saying things like, "You are mad," in the margins. Dr. Garlow totally rewrote the conclusion to the paper. The sentence that said, "We cannot find the cause of AIDS," when published said the reverse, that we think we found it. Dr. Popovic's statement that Dr. Garlow's theory about the cause of AIDS, Dr. Popovic called that statement, that theory, an assumption.